A wall of black cloud rolled across the Wyoming sky so fast that it seemed to swallow the afternoon whole. On the empty ridge below, one broken freight wagon leaned to one side with a cracked front axle. A lone mule stood frozen in its harness. It did not pull. It did not cry. Its ears stayed flat against its head while it stared toward the north. The woman beside it never looked at the wagon. She looked only at the storm. The air had gone silent. Not a single blade of dry grass moved. That silence frightened her more than the cloud itself, because she had heard it once before, and the last people who ignored it never came home. If you enjoy true frontier survival stories inspired by the forgotten wisdom of the American West, stay with this journey. The hardest part has not even begun. Henrietta Marsh stood 31 years old on the lonely Rosebud Bighorn Trail in the closing days of November 1884. Most travelers feared wolves. Others feared robbers. She feared the sky. Her father had spent half his life reading storms long before weather offices existed. He always said that clouds spoke long before thunder ever did. Today, the sky was shouting. She closed her eyes for one slow breath. The cold carried no smell. No wind touched her face. Even Juniper, the mule she had raised since it was only a few days old, refused to take another step. Animals often noticed danger before people ever could. Henrietta rested one hand against Juniper's neck. The thick muscles beneath the coat trembled without moving. She whispered quietly, "Easy, girl." The mule answered with one slow breath. Nothing more. Henrietta turned once across the open prairie. Nothing. No cabin. No smoke. No trees tall enough to block the coming wind. Nearly 60 miles separated her from the nearest settlement. 2 hours if she was lucky. Maybe less. Only 6 days earlier she had left Fort Benton with everything she still owned packed into that wagon. The trading post she and her husband had built no longer belonged to her. Neither did the house behind it. When Wendell died the previous winter, she believed grief had already taken everything. She learned later that grief had only opened the door. Debt finished the rest. A banker from Chicago had arrived carrying legal papers instead of sympathy. He never raised his voice. He never insulted her. He simply placed document after document across her kitchen table until every signature pointed to the same ending. 30 days. Leave the property. Everything else belonged to creditors. Henrietta packed alone. Neighbors watched from across the street. Some offered small prayers. Others quietly wondered whether a widow could survive a Wyoming winter by herself. She answered none of them. Her older brother, Ambrose, lived near Story in northern Wyoming. He had written months earlier that she would always have a place there. His letter never reached her before winter closed the mail routes. Waiting meant starvation. Travel meant risk. She chose the road. Now that road had betrayed her. The cracked axle had broken 2 days earlier, crossing a rocky stream. She repaired it well enough to keep moving. The canvas cover tore loose during another storm. Every mile south became slower than the last. Now the wagon itself could barely roll. Henrietta climbed onto the broken seat one final time. She studied the western hills. Nothing. Then something caught her eye. Far below the ridge, hidden beneath weathered sandstone cliffs, she noticed a darker shape carved into the rock. Not a cave. Not exactly. More like the shadow of a room. She narrowed her eyes. Her father had once told her something while repairing a fishing shed many years earlier. A weak wall, with no openings, will beat a strong wall full of cracks. She never forgot those words. At the time, they meant nothing. Today, they returned as clearly as if he were standing beside her. She climbed down. Juniper followed without being pulled. Together, they crossed the frozen grass toward the sandstone bluff. The closer they came, the larger the hollow appeared. The opening faced east. The heavy rock above curved outward like the roof of a porch. The floor inside looked dry. 3 sides were already closed by solid stone. Henrietta stepped inside. Her boots scraped across packed sand instead of snow. She reached one hand against the cool wall. The rock did not shake. The wind outside had still not returned. 3 walls. Her breathing slowed. Only one side remained open. She slowly turned toward the ridge. Her broken wagon sat nearly 400 yards away. Most people would have seen useless timber. Henrietta saw the missing wall. She looked from the hollow, back to the wagon, back again. The distance suddenly felt much longer. She calculated the weight without speaking. The wagon bed alone weighed nearly 200 pounds. No horse, no neighbors, no passing travelers, only her, and the storm. She tied Juniper inside the sandstone hollow beside a twisted cedar growing from a crack in the rock. The mule lowered its head without resisting. Henrietta rested both hands against its face. "I'll come back." Then she turned. She ran uphill toward the broken wagon. Behind her, the first breath of wind finally crossed the prairie. Not strong. Not yet. Just enough to lift a thin ribbon of snow across the frozen ground. Henrietta stopped only once. She looked over her shoulder. The wall of cloud had already reached the ridge. Its edge curled downward like a giant wave preparing to break across the plains. She tightened her coat. Kept running. Because somewhere between the broken wagon and the waiting hollow beneath the sandstone stood the thin line between surviving the night or becoming another frozen traveler the Wyoming winter would never return. The rope dug deeper into Henrietta's shoulders the moment she leaned her full weight against the wagon bed. Nothing happened. The broken wooden box sat frozen where it rested. She tightened her grip. Her boots slipped across the thin frost. She lowered herself another inch. Then, with a sharp scrape that echoed across the empty ridge, the wagon bed finally moved. Only a few inches, but it moved. Henrietta never looked back. She simply kept walking. Every slow step carved another shallow groove through the frozen grass. The heavy timber followed behind like an anchor, refusing to leave the earth. Above her, the first loose snow began racing sideways across the prairie. The blizzard had started. Not with roaring wind, with whispers. Thin white streaks skimmed across the ground, almost beautiful. Her father had once warned her about that. The first snow never attacks. It measures. She understood those words now. The storm was testing every opening before it showed its full strength. Henrietta counted each step instead of thinking about the distance. 20, 40, 60. The rope burned through her coat. Her breathing turned rough. Warm air left her mouth in thick white clouds before disappearing into the growing darkness. Halfway to the sandstone hollow, her knees folded beneath her. The wagon stopped. She stayed on both hands for several seconds while her breath settled. Her shoulders shook from the effort. Not from weakness, from carrying more than one person should ever carry alone. She reached inside her coat for a swallow of water. Her fingers brushed something folded inside the inner pocket. 2 letters. One from Wendell, one she had never opened. The second letter had rested beneath her father's toolbox since the morning she left Montana. She had noticed it only minutes earlier while searching for rope. There had been no time to read it. There still wasn't. She pressed the paper flat against her chest. Then she stood again. The wagon scraped forward another yard. Behind her, the wind found its voice. It rushed over the ridge with a long, hollow sound that rolled across the prairie like distant freight cars. Juniper answered with one sharp call from inside the rock hollow. "I'm coming," Henrietta whispered. Whether she spoke to the mule or herself, she wasn't sure. By the time she reached the sandstone shelter, the daylight had already faded into a dull gray. The air felt colder by the minute. She pulled the wagon bed sideways across the entrance. It covered only the middle. Large openings remained on both sides. Another stretched across the top beneath the stone overhang. 3 gaps. 3 invitations for the wind. Henrietta wasted no time. She climbed onto the broken frame. The torn wagon canvas still clung to the splintered bows. She ripped every remaining strip loose. Her fingers fought stiff leather straps that had frozen during the night before. One finally snapped free. Then another. She dragged the heavy canvas over the wagon bed and stretched it tight across the upper opening. Flat rocks held the edges in place. The wind caught the cloth at once. It cracked like a rifle shot. Henrietta gathered larger stones, one after another. Each rock pressed another corner firmly against the timber. The canvas stopped moving. Only the side openings remained. She turned toward the hillside. Dry prairie grass covered the slope in thick brown clumps. She grabbed both hands full. Pulled. The roots resisted. Another pull. The frozen earth finally released them. She carried armful after armful back to the entrance. The grass disappeared into every crack between rock and wagon. She packed it tightly with both fists. No daylight. No empty space. No opening wider than a finger. The work became almost mechanical. Pull, carry, pack. Repeat. Soon her fingertips stopped hurting altogether. That frightened her. Feeling nothing in weather like this was never a good sign. She rubbed both hands together until a dull sting returned. Then she kept working. The storm had no intention of waiting. Snow began striking the outside wall in fast, dry bursts. Juniper shifted farther into the back of the hollow. The mule stood quietly. Its warm breath slowly filled the small shelter. Henrietta noticed something unexpected. The air inside already felt different. Still cold, but no longer biting. The stone trapped warmth. The animal added more. Her father had once explained that survival wasn't always about making heat. Sometimes it was simply about refusing to lose it. She stepped backward to inspect her work. The entrance looked rough. Broken timber, frozen canvas, dead grass, sandstone. Nothing about it appeared impressive. Anyone passing the bluff would probably laugh at such a shelter. Henrietta didn't need it to look strong. She only needed it to stay closed. The first full blast of the blizzard slammed into the cliff. The sound shook the rock beneath her boots. Snow exploded across the entrance. The canvas stretched tight. The packed grass barely moved. She watched carefully, searching, listening, waiting for one loose corner, one weak seam. Nothing opened. The wall held. A deep breath escaped her, not because the danger had passed, because now she finally had one chance to survive it. She spread her blankets across the dry sandstone floor, placed her small food sack beside them, set the water canteen near the rock wall where it would stay from freezing as long as possible. Then she opened her father's toolbox. Inside rested his hammer, his chisel, his hand saw. Each tool exactly where he had left it years earlier. Beneath them lay the folded letter. This time she picked it up. The wind outside screamed louder. She unfolded the paper carefully. Across the top, written in her father's steady hand, were only 6 words. For the day you stand alone. Henrietta stared at the page. Then another violent crash struck somewhere outside the shelter. Not wood. Not rock. Something much heavier. Something large had hit the outer wall. Juniper jerked upright. Henrietta slowly lowered the letter. She held her breath. The sound came again. Closer this time, whatever stood outside was moving around the entrance. A second impact struck the outside wall. Harder this time. The entire wagon bed shuddered. Dust drifted from the sandstone ceiling. Henrietta stayed perfectly still. One hand rested on the handle of her father's hammer. The other remained against Juniper's neck. Neither of them made a sound. Another heavy scrape dragged slowly across the frozen timber outside. Wood groaned. Canvas tightened. Then came silence. Not the quiet that had settled before the storm. A different silence. The kind that forced every heartbeat to sound louder than it should. Henrietta moved one careful step toward the narrow crack where a sliver of light slipped through the packed grass. She did not pull anything away. She simply placed one eye against the smallest opening. Nothing. Only blowing snow. White sheets raced across the prairie so thick they hid everything beyond a few yards. The sound came again. Closer. A dull scrape. Then another, this time lower against the wagon bed. Henrietta frowned. Whatever stood outside wasn't clawing. It wasn't breathing. It wasn't walking. It was rolling. She waited another minute. The scraping stopped. Only the wind remained. A deep breath escaped her lips. The blizzard had picked up loose tumbleweeds from the open prairie. The frozen bushes were slamming against the shelter before rolling away again. She almost laughed. Instead, she closed her eyes for 1 second. The danger outside was already large enough. Her own imagination did not need to become another enemy. She returned to the back of the hollow. Juniper lowered its head beside her shoulder. The mule's warm breath drifted across her cheek. Henrietta unfolded her father's letter. The paper had yellowed with age. His careful handwriting filled both sides. She began reading by the dim gray light leaking through the frozen canvas. My dear Henrietta, if you are reading this, then the day has arrived that every father hopes never finds his daughter. She swallowed slowly. Outside, the wind pushed against the bluff with a steady roar. Inside, only her father's words seemed to exist. A storm is never your enemy because of its strength. It becomes dangerous only when it convinces you to waste your strength fighting it. Henrietta paused. Those words sounded exactly like him. Plain, simple, useful. No speeches, no grand lessons. Only truth earned through years of hard winters. She continued, find something stronger than yourself. Stand beside it. Use what already exists before trying to build something new. Her eyes slowly lifted toward the sandstone walls. 3 solid walls had stood here for thousands of years. She had added only one. Nothing more. Her father had been teaching this lesson long before she understood it. She folded the letter carefully. Not because she had finished reading, because another sound reached her ears. Voices, very faint, almost impossible to hear beneath the wind. She froze. Juniper lifted its ears. There it was again, someone shouting. Far away, Henrietta crawled toward the entrance. This time she carefully lifted one corner of the frozen blanket, just enough to see outside. The blizzard still covered everything. Nothing. She almost closed it again. Then movement appeared. Several dark shapes stumbled across the ridge nearly 200 yards away. People. 5. No. 6. They leaned against the wind so sharply they looked ready to fall sideways. One horse dragged behind them without a rider. Another man disappeared completely inside the blowing snow before struggling upright again. Henrietta's heart pounded. Travelers. They had walked straight into the storm. She waved instinctively. No one looked her way. The snow erased the sandstone bluff almost completely. From the ridge, the shelter simply looked like another piece of rock. She shouted. The wind stole every word. Again. Nothing. The travelers kept moving. Not toward her. Past her. Straight into the open prairie. Henrietta grabbed the old brass signaling mirror from her supply box. No sunlight. Useless. She searched quickly, then found a lantern. Only half full of kerosene. Lighting it now meant burning precious air inside the shelter. Waiting meant those people might disappear forever. She hesitated. Only a moment. Then she struck the match. The tiny flame flickered inside the lantern. She held it close to the narrow opening beneath the blanket. A warm yellow glow spilled across the blowing snow. Weak, small, almost invisible. She raised it higher. One traveler stopped. Another stumbled into him. The group turned. Henrietta lifted the lantern again. One man pointed directly toward the bluff. She could not hear his voice. She didn't need to. They had seen it. Slowly, painfully, the 6 figures changed direction. Each step looked harder than the last. One woman collapsed to her knees. The others pulled her back up. Henrietta rushed outside for only seconds. She pushed deeper footprints toward the entrance, then hurried back before the wind could steal her own warmth. The strangers followed the tracks. Closer, closer, until the first man reached the wagon wall. His beard was completely white with ice. His lips barely moved. "Please." Henrietta pulled away the blanket. Inside. No one asked permission twice. One after another they squeezed through the narrow opening. An older couple, 2 young brothers, a teenage girl, a wounded ranch hand whose left arm hung against his side. The last traveler pulled the blanket shut behind him. Instantly, the roar outside became distant again. The small shelter that had barely held 1 woman and 1 mule now held 8 souls. Nobody spoke for several long moments. Only exhausted breathing filled the hollow. Finally, the oldest man looked around the shelter. His eyes settled on the broken wagon wall, the packed grass, the frozen canvas. Then on Henrietta. His cracked lips moved slowly. "We passed 19 wagons on the North Trail." He lowered his head. They never found shelter. The hollow fell silent. Henrietta slowly looked toward the frozen wall she had built with bleeding hands. Without that single decision, every person inside this sandstone hollow would already have been lying beneath the snow. The 6 strangers sat shoulder to shoulder inside the narrow sandstone hollow. Nobody complained about the cramped space. Nobody cared. Every breath rising inside that shelter meant another life, still fighting through the night. Henrietta divided the last of her dried meat into tiny pieces. No one received much. Everyone received something. The wounded ranch hand tried to refuse. She quietly placed the food into his hand anyway. "You'll need it before morning." He nodded once. His frozen fingers barely closed around it. The oldest traveler finally introduced himself. "My name's Walter Briggs." His beard still carried tiny crystals of ice. "We were hauling supplies south from Sheridan." He looked toward the sealed entrance. "There were 25 wagons when we left." Nobody answered. Walter continued after several slow breaths. "The storm split us apart." His voice almost disappeared. "We watched wagon after wagon vanish inside the snow." His hands tightened around his cap. "We kept walking because stopping meant joining them." Silence filled the shelter again. Even the wind outside seemed farther away now. Henrietta looked toward the frozen wall she had built. It no longer looked like broken lumber. Snow had buried nearly the entire outside. Ice sealed every crack. The storm itself had finished the work she started. Hours passed. Nobody measured time. They measured breathing. Each person stood every so often, moved their arms, stamped their boots, rubbed frozen fingers together, then sat back down. No one allowed another traveler to remain still too long. The smallest girl inside the shelter could not have been older than 14. She leaned quietly against her grandmother's shoulder. Henrietta noticed her lips turning pale. Without speaking, she removed her own wool scarf. She wrapped it around the girl's neck. The grandmother reached for Henrietta's hand. No words came, only tired eyes. Sometimes gratitude required nothing else. Sometime after midnight, Walter crawled beside Henrietta. He studied the wall carefully. "You built this today?" Henrietta nodded. "With that wagon?" Another nod. Walter slowly shook his head. "I've built barns for 20 years. His rough hand rested against the packed grass. "I would have tried building a fire." Henrietta smiled faintly. "My father would have called that the fastest way to freeze." Walter looked at her curiously. He always said the wind steals heat faster than fire can replace it. Walter stared quietly at the frozen entrance. After several moments, he whispered almost to himself, "I wish I'd met your father." Outside, the blizzard slowly lost its strength. The roar became a long sigh, then smaller gusts, then only scattered whispers moving across the cliff. Nobody rushed outside. Henrietta remembered another lesson. The first quiet can lie. So everyone waited. 1 full hour. Then another. Finally, Juniper lifted its head. The mule walked toward the entrance on its own. Its ears stood forward. Its breathing stayed calm. Animals noticed endings just as quickly as beginnings. Henrietta rose carefully. Her legs protested every movement. She pushed frozen snow away from the entrance using a broken board. Light slowly entered the hollow. Soft. White. almost blinding after so many hours inside darkness. Cold air drifted through the opening, but it no longer carried anger, only winter. One by one, the travelers stepped outside. Nobody spoke. The prairie looked completely different. Snow buried nearly everything. Only the highest ridges remained visible. The wagon tracks leading toward the hollow had disappeared completely. Henrietta turned slowly toward the northern trail. Dark shapes stood scattered across the white landscape. Broken wagons, dead horses, pieces of canvas half buried beneath drifting snow. Walter removed his hat. The others did the same. No words crossed the empty prairie. They simply stood together while the cold morning settled around them. After a long while, the wounded ranch hand pointed toward Henrietta's shelter. "I would have walked right past it," Walter answered quietly. "So would every one of us." The little girl looked back at the sandstone hollow. "It doesn't even look like a home." Henrietta smiled gently. "It wasn't meant to. It only needed to last one night." By late afternoon, they reached the nearest settlement. News of the storm had already spread. Search parties prepared sleds before sunrise. Henrietta joined them without hesitation. For 2 days, they searched frozen draws, shallow ravines, and abandoned trails. 19 travelers were found beneath the snow. None had reached shelter. The 6 people from the sandstone hollow returned alive. Weeks later, carpenters, freight drivers, ranchers, and survey crews rode north to see the strange place people had begun talking about. They expected a cave. They expected some hidden cabin. Instead, they found a simple sandstone recess. A broken wagon bed. Frozen grass packed between rough stones. Nothing more. Several old freighters stood silently inside the hollow. One finally removed his gloves and touched the weathered timber. "So this is what beat the blizzard," Henrietta quietly answered. "No." She rested her hand against the sandstone wall. "This did." The wagon only closed the doorway. Before spring arrived, travelers along the Rosebud Bighorn Trail began building small emergency shelters beside dangerous crossings and exposed ridges. Most were nothing more than stone walls with heavy timber doors. Nobody argued about how they should be built. They simply copied what had already saved lives. Years later, newcomers asked why so many lonely shelters stood scattered across empty Wyoming country. The older freighters always gave nearly the same answer. A widow showed us that survival isn't always about finding the perfect place. Sometimes it's about seeing the shelter that's already waiting. Long after the broken wagon had finally rotted back into the prairie. Long after the names of most travelers faded from memory. The sandstone hollow remained. Wind still crossed the ridge every winter. Snow still buried the entrance. But anyone who stood there could still imagine one woman pulling a wrecked wagon across frozen ground while the sky closed above her. If this story stayed with you, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who enjoys forgotten frontier survival stories.